Welcome in for another edition of Armchair Quarterback. I'm David Allen, and joining me, as always, Coach Guy Suttle. And I might as well say, as always, Paul Foster. Paul's been with us pretty much the entire season, but hey, we're hoping that Rob Roop's going to get back here before too much longer. But anyway, we talk each week about our Cleveland County sports teams as far as football is concerned. Then we'll look at a little college football, Gardner-Webb University, and then we'll finish up Carolina Panthers and some NFL news and talk a little bit about, well, I have to talk about my Cowboys beating the Steelers last night. We'll have to do that a little bit too. But let's start with our, go ahead, Coach. Go ahead.
I think the headline I saw this morning, and folks, I still don't have internet or cable, so it was stolen. Cowboys steal.
Oh, no.
Game from Steelers?
Oh, no.
Okay.
No, we'll talk about that at the end of the show. But no, that's not the case at all. All right, let's talk about our teams that we were back in action following the week of the hurricane. My goodness, what a mess. A lot of you in town probably just got your power back. I know Guy and I just got ours back yesterday, which was Sunday, October the 6th. So we missed ours for 9 days. We're glad to have it back. And we are with you all that are dealing with those kinds of issues. But very fortunate in Cleveland County that our teams were able to play Friday, even though they did not go to school last week. And, you know, that worked out well. And we'll see. The High School Athletic Association will announce on Wednesday what they're going to do about the rest of the season, whether they're going to add a week, possibly add 2 weeks, possibly change the playoff format because of the schools to the west of us that are extremely affected. So we go back to the week of the hurricane. Shelby got that game in on Wednesday night. The only team in the town in the county that was able to play, knocked off Thomas Jefferson 70-0. Kings Mountain and Crest were due to try and play, I think, on different times. Kings Mountain on Thursday night, Crest on Monday night. Of course, none of those games happened, and those will be the games that we'll find out about as the NCHSAA announces whatever extension they did. So that was Kings Mountain at North Gaston that currently has been postponed, Crest and Stuart Kramer that has currently been postponed, and we'll give you the updates on that when we get it. Burns, fortunately enough for the Bulldogs, was open that week, so they don't have a game to make up from that week that was missed due to the hurricane. Now, with all of that said, let's go to Friday night. Burns against Bessemer City. This is one that Bessemer City is the best the best 1A team in this conference this year. But still, Guy, 48-0, it was not a close one.
Yeah, and from what I understand, they are the best 1A school in that conference. Yet it just shows you there's still a huge gap between the 1As and the 2As in this conference. Some people were impressed about how they looked when they got off the bus, that they did have some size, they did have a little bit of speed, but as you can see, it's turnover after turnover after turnover.
Well, and Paul, this is, not something that surprises us at this point after this being the fourth year in this 2A, 1A split. Shelby and Burns have completely decimated the competition in the 1A category. And, here's some highlights from the Burns game of the Bulldogs doing just that on Friday night.
You're right about that, Dave. They're now 2-0 in conference play. As Burns, we'll talk about Shelby more in a little bit. They went to 3-0, but, they've got Goodson in the backfield. He had a big night. Burns overall as a team had a big night of rushing. That's their main bread and butter, and they definitely put that to use. I think they only threw the ball maybe 2 times in that entire game. But Goodson rushing for now over 350 yards, and he's also one of their leading tacklers, so he's doing it on both sides of the football.
No question about that. So Burns 48-0, the final over Bessemer City on Friday night. Now we'll talk about the Crest and South Point game. Obviously the game of the week in terms of competition and tough battle and all that kind of stuff. Coach, Crest up early in that one. I think at one point we'll see in the highlights, but at one point 26-12 lead late. And the one thing you cannot do is count out the Red Raiders, especially at home, and they were able to come back and pull that one out.
Yeah, from what I understand, there was a play there toward the end where Crest actually had South Point 4th and 20, and a ball gets batted up in the air, the pass play gets batted up in the air, and South Point comes down with it for a first down, and they score the next play. So that can be a backbreaker right there.
Paul, you're calling that game from the visitor stands, we understand, on Friday night on the radio. But again, anytime a Cleveland County team has gone to South Point, and I can go back to a big game in 1978 when Jim Taylor was the new head coach of the Golden Lions. It is a dogfight in Belmont if you go to South Point, regardless.
It always is, and you know, you can even throw out, you know, records and all that kind of stuff, even though generally these two teams are in the thick of things. Here, I believe, is the one that was all the way. This is what hurt Crest towards the end. You had a kick return for the touchdown. There's the scenes of it right there. And then later, as Guy already talked about, South Point was fortunate to have a pass go through one receiver's hands into another, set them up on 4th and 1. And even though we saw the Crest touchdown there, it was the quarterback right there, number 5 for South Point, that would go over 70 yards for the touchdown that put South Point within 1. And then what did they do? With under 2 minutes to go, they went for 2. They got it. They had the 1-point lead. And you know, guys, from there, with 1:54 to go in the game, you thought Crest might still have an opportunity. But on the kick from South Point, and there's the quarterback keeping the ball and going for over 70 yards. That was just a killer right there. Crest made the mistake of trying to lateral the kick return from one end of the field to the other. It was a loose football. South Point got it, and that would end up winning the football game.
Guy, what is it about games with South Point and Cleveland County opponents where a 2-point conversion at the end is the difference in the ball game? Whether you get it or you don't get it, it ends up being the difference in the ball game.
Right. How many times have we lived through that one? And the thing about it is it's not just Shelby and South Point that I've witnessed that. When this used to be the last game of the season with Crest, Mark Barnes' first year, same thing. It was a unsportsmanlike conduct. We had to go for 2. Unsportsmanlike conduct on the touchdown, and end up with a extra point try from the 18-yard line. So it happens. It's just something about that South Point Red Raider Stadium that things happen.
Absolutely. So, again, a tough loss for the Chargers. The first of the season for Crest, 27-26. They fall at South Point. The Red Raiders now, in the driver's seat in the Big South, but they've got Kings Mountain coming up Friday. We'll talk more about that in our second segment. Speaking of the Mountaineers, that game with Forest View on Friday night, a lot closer than a lot of people thought for at least a good portion of the game. It was 14-14 after the first quarter, still a close game at halftime. Then finally, Josiah Hill and company pulling away in the second half. Paul, one of the things that surprised me about that game for Kings Mountain was, William Vaughn was held to 1 catch for 5 yards, and he has been their superstar go-to wide receiver. And, Forest View, whether they schemed something or whether Vaughn just had a bad night, I don't know, but they really held him in check, and that kept them maybe in the ball game a lot longer than they should have been.
I think that's a good point, because when you look at the stats on Vaughn, over 509 receiving yards, 6 touchdowns, and to think that really had nothing to do with what happened in that game, which they still won this past Friday night. But, another thing that we talked about, some of us talking about the game since Friday night, is that wonder if some of the rust and not as many practices and waiting for, about a 2-week period to play a game again worked maybe on Crest some and Kings Mountain, and showed at least for some of that Kings Mountain game.
Well, it didn't bother Josiah Hill. 23 carries for 141 and 4 touchdowns. And, Guy, you coached his dad at Shelby. And so we know the family, but Josiah, a big game for Kings Mountain. And, of course, they needed it in that 41-23 win.
Yeah, Javion, his dad was a good athlete, but he wasn't a running back.
No, he was not a running back.
He was a big boy. No, for Kings Mountain, and we'll talk more about this in the second segment, there's some challenges that Kings Mountain still has to figure out to get where they want to be in the conference and going into the playoffs. And I know we say playoffs really quick. It is winding down. It'll be over before you know it. As far as the practice schedule and things of this nature, it's got to be a little bit odd, especially for Crest, because they were thinking about playing Stuart Kramer on Monday, which didn't happen. Then you find out, hey, we're just going to table that game until the NCHSAA figures it out. So now we got to get ready for South Point. So really, you don't have but 2.5 days to really figure out what you're going to do game-wise against South Point. And they run something that is not traditional. They run an offense that is more accustomed to what I was seeing 30 years ago, and it's not accustomed now.
Well, and you can say that, but Greg Lloyd knew that South Point was coming up, and they've been talking about South Point for a while at Crest.
Oh, I'm sure they have.
I guarantee you they didn't wait till 2.5 days to try and get ready for South Point. But needless to say, there's your final score, 41-23, Kings Mountain over Forest View. And as we mentioned, Kings Mountain now has South Point coming up on Friday night. Final game of the week, I'll give you one stat, Paul, for this one. Shelby had 4 carries for 238 yards and 4 touchdowns. When I say they had 4 carries, there were 4 rushing attempts for the Golden Lions on offense for 238 yards and 4 touchdowns against Highland Tech in this one.
I went to look at the stats for this game, and I almost wondered if somebody left out some information, and you just explained it to me, David. I saw all these yards, but I saw so few carries compared to usual for the Golden Lions, so that says a lot right now, right there, just how many yards you were getting per carry, and it came easy for the Lions last Friday night.
I want to say they ran like 6 offensive plays in the first half, and it was 56-0 at halftime. The punt game for Highland Tech was probably one of the most dismal aspects of the game. Shelby now in this portion of the schedule, they've scored on the first play of the game 3 straight weeks. They scored on the first play against Cherryville, the first play against Thomas Jefferson, and after Majay Thompson ran the kickback to the 12, they were able to score easily on the first play against Highland Tech. This game ends up, as there you see Tristan Tate on one of the 4 carries of the ball game. But, needless to say, Dr. Stephen Fisher is on the realignment committee for the High School Athletic Association, so the only thing we can say is thank goodness maybe this will be the end of this conference for Shelby and Burns moving forward. Golden Lions, you see plays like that, Golden Lions in dominant fashion defeat Highland Tech on Friday night, 77-0, the final in that one. So the combined 3 games Shelby has played so far against the 1As, 217-0, and that's pitiful. They shouldn't have to do that, but it is what it is. Hey, when we come back, we'll talk about our games coming up for this week, and we'll do that next. You're watching Armchair Quarterback.
The only prediction I'd make is I'd be pretty willing to bet I won't be doing it in 20 more years.
My question is, where's our residual checks?
144 have taken Republican ballots, and Wes and 2 others have taken Libertarian ballots.
Pravda, however, TBS, however.
Wes.
West.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's get ready to rumble!
Welcome back in for our second segment of Armchair Quarterback. I'm David Allen, joined as always by Coach Guy Suttle and Paul Foster. This is the segment where we'll talk about what's coming up this week for our teams, and then we'll also talk a little college and pro. There you see the first one. Burns at Thomas Jefferson. Not a lot to say about this one. Shelby just beat Thomas Jefferson 70-0 week before last. Burns, I feel like, Coach, this one 70-0 is a good guess.
Yeah, it's a yawner. I don't know. There's not a whole lot you can say about this one other than Burns is still improving on Burns. That's all. They got better competition in practice than what they'll see on Friday night.
No question about it. Crest will be at home against North Gaston, and this one is an opportunity for the Chargers. Coach Greg Lloyd against former defensive coordinator Darrell Wilson, who's now the head coach at North Gaston. North Gaston should have played Kings Mountain in the storm week, didn't get that game. So that's going to be a little bit different for them, but needless to say, Crest heavily favored Paul in this one.
They're going to be heavily favored, and I'm interested to see if we can see more of the best qualities of Crest football come out in that game, since you've had more time to get ready for it. Everybody's expecting a big win, but I do hope that we have a chance to see some reserves and others get some big moments in that game for Crest.
Right, just the comparative score, and we don't do this all the time, but we do this sometimes. But just let me throw this one out there. North Gaston lost to Bessemer City. Burns beat Bessemer City last week 48-0. That's enough said. Nothing against Coach Wilson and the program that he's going to try to build over there at North Gaston, but this should not be a competitive ball game on Friday night with Crest and North Gaston. Shelby is open this week, so we'll talk about, just go ahead and mention that so that we can talk about the big game of the week. South Point 4-0 at Kings Mountain 4-1. Guys, this is, you got South Point coming off this big win against Crest. Possibly, Coach, could we see a little bit of a letdown for the Red Raiders against Kings Mountain?
No, I doubt it. That's one thing about South Point. They will know, they understand who their opponent is, what they got to do. The trouble or the concerning part for Kings Mountain in this game is South Point has scored points against everybody they've played, Crest included. It's going to be points that Kings Mountain needs to score to win this game. Can they keep up? You're almost looking at 4 touchdowns by South Point. Can you outscore them? Because nobody has stopped them, not really.
Another thing I think is going to be big in that game, guys, is Kings Mountain doesn't want to have what Crest happened to them in the game, and that is a special teams touchdown. Special teams needs to be good on both sides of the football, and just being able to contain the quarterback. South Point's got a lot of talent, and they've got a couple of big fullbacks, but they weren't as effective. It was all about that quarterback for the most part in the Crest game when they got significant yardage. So I think those would be key things for Kings Mountain to try to do.
All right, so Tim already threw the graphic up there. We'll show you that again. They're going to add a couple of dollars to the ticket price, so it'll be like a county game. It'll be a 10-point ticket. Obviously, Kings Mountain, South Point, it's worth $10 anyway, and then two of those dollars on each ticket are going to go up to Pisgah High School, one of those teams over in the western part of the state that has been devastated by the hurricane last week. There's the week eight, hard to believe. Burns at Thomas Jefferson, North Gaston at Crest, South Point at Kings Mountain, and the Golden Lions are open this week. Big week in the college top 25. 6 different ranked teams in the top 25 coming up on the losing end this past weekend, including number 1 Alabama. I think every joke that's ever been told about Vanderbilt football has to go out the window a little bit this week, Coach, after Vandy pulls the 40-35 upset over the Bama Roll Tide.
Yeah, I'm sure there was an algorithm or something that was used to figure out how they could beat Alabama in this one. It's just a stunner. I think that is one thing that that Alabama has done over the years is not stump their toe, not let this happen to them. But unfortunately, it did this year. I was fortunate enough to watch a little bit of the Tennessee game, and it was the same way. You were wondering at number 4 if Arkansas was going to pull off an upset, but Tennessee just overpowered them in the fourth quarter.
Well, you mentioned Arkansas, the 19-14 over number 4 Tennessee. 25 Texas A&M was the only ranked team that beat a ranked team, and that was a 41-10 whipping of Missouri. Missouri was number 9. Washington by 10 over number 10 Michigan. Minnesota, of all people. Carolina beat Minnesota, and we see what's happened to Carolina. 24-17 over Southern Cal, and SMU in an ACC game. SMU beats Louisville. Louisville was the ranked team there. 22nd ranked. Gardner-Webb takes another tough loss, this one to UT Martin, 35-17. Gardner-Webb at 1-5 now on the season, and this is their bye week or their open week coming up. And I think, Paul, if you had to say, if you're Gardner-Webb, you're kind of glad that there's not a game on the schedule this coming Saturday.
I think so. I think it's good that they get a break. You know, I spent a lot of years as a former employee over at Gardner-Webb University and still talk to a lot of folks over there. And I think what we've talked about in our prior shows, Gardner-Webb was so close in those games early on, and when you don't quite get it done against Wofford, and you think about, oh man, we possibly could have beat James Madison, who was red hot until I believe they got beat for the first time this past weekend. If Gardner-Webb would have got one or two of those, we could be talking about a whole different scenario. Your record would be better, you would be feeling a lot better, so this is a good time for that bye week.
No question about it. Some other big games this weekend. South Carolina just took one on the chin with Ole Miss, and they're going to get a mean, bee in your bonnet, Alabama, whatever you want to say about that one. David Pless, sorry, your Gamecocks might be in trouble. Carolina and Georgia Tech. I mean, Georgia Tech has beat Carolina the last 2 years when Carolina was heavily favored.
That's right.
Maybe Carolina will sneak up and get Georgia Tech this week.
Exactly, and you never really know which team is going to show up, especially even with Georgia Tech. I mean, you're just not sure, but I think Carolina gets back into the win column this week, just simply able to put some points on the board.
Paul, biggest game on the schedule, number 2, Ohio State against number 3, Oregon this week. That one will filter out some of the chaff a little bit. Of course, we get 12 teams in the playoff this year, so it won't filter it out completely, but it at least give us some idea of who is exactly the number 2 team in the country, probably.
Yeah, you know, with the conference changes that we've seen now, to think about Oregon and Ohio State under the same umbrella, so to speak, I find fascinating. I used to be one of those that loved to stay up late on Saturday night and see from the Pacific Northwest Oregon football, because it's been, you know, so good, and some quality players and coaches have come through that program. So here we go now. It's going to be a great rivalry with Ohio State and Oregon.
Well, talk about the Wolfpack, a tough loss for NC State as they lost to Wake Forest. Now they've got Syracuse coming. Syracuse is 4-1,
Yep.
so that is not that is not what you might think over the last few years. Maybe that State might get well against Syracuse. They're probably not going to get well against Syracuse.
No, I would think that Syracuse is going to play way better than what they have shown over the last 2 or 3 years. So yeah, I would have to say that State's in trouble.
Well, so it's interesting because we have added the 12-team playoff this year, and now it seems like the schedule is in more chaos already this year, with Georgia losing to Alabama, then Alabama turning around and losing to Vandy. You had Clemson getting beat early. You've had Michigan get beat. You've had a lot of the teams that are considered national powers that have already stumped their toe, as Coach said earlier. And so that is going to be interesting to see how all of this plays out. Those conference championship games this year to determine who gets those byes in the playoff bracket are going to be absolutely huge. So that's going to bring a whole level of interest back to the college game. Maybe that last weekend in November, first weekend in December had kind of lost some of that luster, is going to gain some of that back this year with some of those teams trying to get to that point of the season. And so stay tuned for all that. Let's talk about the NFL just a little bit. We mentioned my Cowboys earlier as they beat the Steelers last night. I don't know who's talking about them stealing that game, but Dallas dominated the game, turned it over 3 times to keep it close. But if you look at the stats, that was clearly a good win for the Cowboys, minus their 2 best defensive players. So that's all needs to be said about that. I won't give you a chance to rebut that one. Let's talk about your Panthers, though. Offensive line's been playing great. We've been talking great stuff about the offensive line, and then it was like last year again yesterday. All of a sudden, offensive line can't block a soul.
No, I don't know whether it's Andy Dalton didn't take them out for dinner, or maybe took them to their least favorite restaurant. I don't know what happened, but it was a reminder of last year. Offensive line just completely fell apart, and you know, the defense, bless their heart, if they have a bad game, it just doubles it. And you know, defensively, they're getting bruised and battered and out on the field a lot.
And Paul saw something at the end of that game you don't see in the NFL very much. I mean, Chicago basically running the score up on the Panthers, hit that last touchdown with, I don't know, however many, it was late in the fourth quarter, and there was a fight in the end zone. The Panthers took serious issue with Chicago running the score up, and I mean, you don't see that in the NFL very much. You see a lot of knee taking at the end of a game.
Yeah, I'm almost sorry I missed that. I think I'd left the game before all that happened. That is interesting. And I tell you another thing is when you go back to that trade, DJ Moore, the receiver, how he, of all the things you would have wanted to hold on to in Carolina, I always thought this guy had so much potential, and I was already showing us that. But now he's a part of these Bears, and what did he do? He tore it up in this win over the Carolina Panthers.
That trade, when you look at that trade on paper, and there's still a 2025 second-round pick coming to the Chicago Bears from the Panthers for that trade from last year that got the Panthers Bryce Young. That may go down literally as one of the worst trades in NFL history when all is said and done. Hopefully, Bryce Young is not completely done, and he'll have a chance to maybe redeem some end of that as far as the Panthers are concerned. But needless to say, that one, only history will tell us how bad that trade was for the Panthers. How about the Minnesota Vikings with Sam Darnold, of all people, a former Carolina quarterback, also a former, top 2-3 pick for the Jets a few years ago. He's playing like it now, and they're 5-0, so are the Minnesota Vikings.
Yeah, and I'm glad for it. You know, we got a local talent that's playing on the defense, is starting defense, Jonathan Bullard.
Absolutely.
And so we're just pulling hard for the Vikings also to keep rolling.
Interesting that Cincinnati is 1-4. Also interesting that the Washington Commanders are 4-1. My dad would be so proud of his former team that they have finally, they found the guy in Jaden Daniels, at least it looks like, through 5 games of this season, Paul.
I'm so glad you brought that up. And speaking of dads, you're remembering that about your dad, Andy Foster. My dad loves what was the Redskins, now the Commanders, and he's loving this. And Redskin fans, you remember back in the day, before we had the Carolina Panthers, you were either a Washington or Dallas fan most of the time. I know Atlanta was out there, but generally we went with one of those two sides. So the Commanders are playing some real good-looking football, and I hope it's going to continue.
Absolutely. Talking about Bryce Young, C.J. Stroud, the number 2 pick in last year's draft, coach, they won again. They're 4-1 on the season.
Yeah, it's just, you know, you do want to wonder though. I mean, it's just, you wish you could just open up a crystal ball and see what C.J. Stroud would look like in a Panthers uniform. It may not be any different because we know that they have issues in other places, and so that could be part of it. I don't know. It's just interesting. Like you said, that history will only tell how bad of a trade this was to get in position to get the overall number 1 draft choice and then pick Bryce Young.
Monday Night Football, Kansas City against New Orleans. Kansas City, the other undefeated team in the NFL, they are injury plagued there right now. Their starting running back and their best starting wide receiver are both out tonight against the Saints, so it'll be interesting to see if they can keep it going on the positive track and stay undefeated. Hey, we're out of time. It's time to get out of here. We thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week right here on Armchair Quarterback.